Reach One started, I had been doing a lot of volunteer work in churches and with faith-based tutoring and different things like that, and had just realized that we needed to be more consistent in the quality of services we were providing for children and their families. And so started looking at the things I had learned as an educator and how they could kind of be taught to people that, whether they're little old ladies from Pasadena or teenagers or whomever, kind of get their skill level up to as close to professional educators as we could and work with curriculum and things like that. And so that's how we started. Several years in, and I've spoken at national conferences and things, it's not really that important. But as a result of a conference I had spoken at, I was invited to go to a congregation where the minister there was doing work in Ukraine. And this was several years before the current conflict, but back when they were fighting in Donetsk. So this is like maybe 2013, 2014 in that area somewhere. And so gone over there, and just long story, but been working with a lot of different situations there with children, primarily children with special needs and orphans, because over there they were trying to get away from the Russian system, which is, I'm sorry, draconian to put it nicely. And so, but they just didn't have the tool sets to do that. And so, for instance, the group I was working with in Zhytomyr, they literally had the only licensed occupational therapist in the entire country because they had sent someone over here to be trained. But what happened, because they were doing stuff no one else in the country was doing, the government was coming to them and saying, how do we do this? How do we do that? And so that's how we started working with them, because those kids don't get therapy, weren't getting therapies. They weren't getting any education. They weren't allowed to go to school, most of them. And so they would take me in a room with a child with mild cerebral palsy and go, well, these are profoundly disabled children. I'm like, no, they're not.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways they kind of were, because they hadn't had all the therapies and things that our children generally get right away when they have those sorts of issues. And so when the war broke out, I was already working with several hundred families, directly and indirectly in that city. And so I was looking for something to share with them, because I knew most of them were so poor, they would not be able to leave Ukraine. And so their children would be exposed to all the war trauma for however long the war lasted, and could not find anything about children in war just a couple of random things, but nothing I really felt confident passing on. And so started doing the research and just really drilled down on everything I could find about children in trauma and children in war, and ended up writing a book. And it's been translated in multiple languages, published by a couple publishers, thousands of copies been given out, and been traveling around mainly through Western Europe, although we did go back into Ukraine a little bit last year, training parents, teachers, believe it or not, therapists, who keep putting in for CE. I go, you realize I'm not a licensed therapist. This is for lay people. And that was the whole purpose of this book. I did not want to be a licensed therapist, although I've since gone back and started my master's in social work about a year into that. But so I do have some more training now, but I specifically wanted it to be things that were safe for lay people to do. And so that parents could do these things with their children, teachers could do these with their students, people in ministry could do this with children at their church. Because, you yourself know in this country how difficult it is sometimes to find a therapist for trauma, especially for a child. And you're in a situation like that in a country that doesn't even really 100% buy into the idea of therapy or counseling or anything like that. And just these children were not going to get help if we didn't figure out ways their parents could help them. And so that's how this all kind of evolved. And like I said, we've been going on for 2.5 years now. And I'll be honest, when I first started doing this, I saw the research. So intellectually, I knew it should work, but I kind of was like, they're probably exaggerating. But some of this stuff is just mind-blowing to me as a layperson, that it works so well. And the stories, as we've circled back to some of these cities a second or third time, people that have been before come back to thank us and tell us. And we've seen children that were just almost catatonic and turn into, within a year, it just like they seem like any other child. Now, that's not saying all their problems are over and everything's hunky-dory, but it's amazing what relatively simple things can make a huge difference. And so that's how this kind of started. Um, when I talk about this, though, there's some things that kind of are basics, and I apologize for you guys. This is probably a little bit redundant, but I just want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same playing field. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk with someone that comes in, it's like you can tell there's trauma, or maybe they say I've been traumatized or something like that. That can mean a whole lot of different things to a whole lot of different people. So you may just talking to someone that just recently had something traumatic happen, or you could be talking to someone that's had a lot of things recently happen that also may have a lot of trauma in their past. And so how you deal with those varying levels of trauma is going to vary somewhat. And so I start out by telling people, and I'm getting more and more in the United States, I make a bigger deal of this than I do overseas because they don't really have a whole lot of options, but we do talk about it. Our first responsibility, I think, when dealing with these people is triage. We've got to help them figure out what we can help them with and what they need professional help with. And we need to also not get in over our head, or not frustrate people trying to help them get therapy and not being able to find it when they maybe don't even really need it that badly. When I started doing all this, I was talking with the gentleman who runs the counseling program at Faulkner, and we were having this conversation. He said, yeah, that's one of the things he's been focusing on, because he said used to, people had friends, they had family, they had churches that would really help them when something was wrong, and they would listen to them, and they would, build them up. And people don't have that anymore. And a lot of people don't even want to get involved in other people's lives. And he said, so they're overloading the counseling system because everybody's like, oh, you're sad? Well, go to go whoever their counselor is that they know, the preacher, or, somebody they know in the community or whatever. And these people are just overwhelmed and overloaded, and there's not enough new ones coming up. And as you guys probably know, they're not all of them are great to begin with. And so it just kind of circles around. And so that was his goal, is trying to make people aware that there are some things you really can help people with, but you also have to know your limits. You have to know where that line is and not try to do something that's, I say, above your pay scale, because if you don't have the proper training in some cases, you can do more harm than good. And so it's important to really understand where that line kind of is. And for me, I kind of thought about the different things and looked in different things and different, now that I've had some counseling experience, I kind of agree with a lot of the list I saw. So if you're working with someone that you think you can help, and then as you're doing all these interventions and things with them, they're not getting better after a little while, or they're starting to get even worse, then you're probably dealing with a situation that for whatever reason you're not equipped to handle, and you need to help them find someone that can. If they have depression, now I'm not talking just, run-of-the-mill sadness, but I'm talking if they've gone into depression and it lasts for more than 2 weeks, they need to start talking to a physician or a professional. If they have anxiety or any other kind of mental health issue that is impairing their ability to function in a daily life, in other words, if they're in bed all day and they don't go to work and they don't go to school, they just can't get out of bed, things like that, that's a sign that they need more help than you're probably able to give them. If they're talking about suicide, now this is really interesting. We had to do a whole unit on suicide, and it kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things. But honestly, I still feel like it's best to err on the side of caution if you don't have training. If someone's talking about committing suicide, and I understand it's become more frequent that teenagers especially can sometimes use suicide as a manipulative tactic. But to me, even if that's what is going on, that child still is probably needing more help than you're able to give, because something's going on that they think is acceptable to threaten their parents or you with, that they're going to commit suicide. There's something that's just probably more than you can handle. So, but especially the really dangerous people, because it's amazing how many people don't commit suicide that threaten it. But if they are also seeming like there's no hope in their life, that they don't have any hope at all, or they mention they have a specific plan, this is like a legit emergency. They need to go into some kind of care immediately. You need to help them find care. To me, that's an ER situation. That's very, very serious if they're coming up with a plan and they're hopeless and all these sorts of things. Also, if you've got a situation where they're becoming obsessed, and we'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks when we start, or next week or next time when we start talking about different interventions. There's certain interventions that lend themselves to the kids sometimes acting out or drawing out a specific incident that happened to them or that they saw or experienced. That's very normal, and I'll tell you some really interesting stories when we get to art. But if they seem to get stuck in that same thing and just keep doing that same thing over and over and over and over again, that's not normal. They've gotten stuck, and you're not going to be able to handle that. You need to hand that off too. If they are extremely withdrawn, although having said that, we had a young lady that was like that, living in Poland, and she just did this stuff, and a year later she was like a different child. So that's not always 100%. If they're extremely aggressive or violent behaviors, destructive behaviors, alcohol, substance abuse, any of those kind of things, eating disorders, if you suspect an eating disorder, all of those kinds of things are going to be things that you really shouldn't be handling, just if nothing else for the patient's, the person's good, but also for your own sanity and mental health, because you can become so overwhelmed that then you start spiraling. And so it's better to help them. One thing that I really liked about that this Professor Faulkner was saying is the mistake that a lot of us make when we're working with someone and we realize, I really think you need more help than I can give you. We just give them a name or a phone number. And he really encourages us and anyone that that when that situation happens, you kind of walk with that person to that situation. You help introduce them to the person. Maybe you go with them and introduce them on their first appointment. Like, you don't make them feel like you've just dropped them, because that's what it can feel like if you just go, oh, wow, you got some serious stuff coming on, call Dr. So-and-so, and then you just kind of ghost them. It just can make situations feel even lonelier than they probably already do. And so I really like that. And I really encourage you guys, as you start working with people, if you do feel like you need to hand them off to someone else, that you walk through them and go with them, or somehow make it so that they don't feel like you've just abandoned them somehow. Do any of you guys have any questions about any of that so far?
No, I was going to comment that I did take your advice on that. I did go with an individual um, who I think just needed a little extra help. And actually, I think that having gone with them to the doctor was, first off, it was kind of an accountability. Like, I could say, okay, yes, you went. And I didn't like go into the doctor. I didn't talk to the doctor. I just went to the doctor and sat in the waiting room with her. But I do think that that it was productive to do, to so that then I could say, okay, we went to the doctor.
Yeah, and then you can feel like the responsibility for the care has been passed on to the doctor or the therapist or whomever, but yet you still have that tie to that person where you can check, how's it going? I was thinking about you.
Right.
Still going to be Dr. So-and-so or whomever. And I think it's just a more caring, I think, way to do that than
Personable.
yeah, more person, especially if you're trying to create a relationship with a person spiritually, or you're in their same church or whatever.
Mhm.
I don't know. I just like it better. I just feel like it's more caring way to handle that. Anything else?
Yeah, no, that's a great reminder to be more thoughtful about that process. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I
It's
get
very
that, because I mean, there have
intimidating.
been people that come to me, not even overseas with the war, but just here, and they're telling me these tales are so convoluted. Like, I know immediately I have not got the skill set to help you figure out even where to start with all of
Mhm.
this entanglement. But it does feel kind of cold sometimes. You go, well, you know what? Why don't you just go to the counseling center, or why don't you just talk to
Yeah.
it doesn't feel good. And so I think this just feels more caring to kind of
Hmm.
walk with them a little bit farther, even if
Yeah.
you're not the one providing the counseling.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is when someone comes to you with their story however little bit or however much they tell you, or maybe someone sent to you, especially if it's a young person, they may be sent to you, they may not be coming on their own. It's important to kind of pay attention to the clues that they give you. They're not all going to open up right away. And if you're dealing with the same types of trauma, maybe there is a mass incident or people just come to you generally for grief or, the same types of things, you will learn what questions to ask to safely get a little bit more information without them feeling like you're drilling down on them or grilling them in some way. So for instance, in the war situation, a parent might come up to me and start telling me just bits and pieces of the problem they were having with their child. And often I would just say, oh, well, tell me about where are you from originally? And I had learned enough after a point, if they said certain cities, I'm like, I knew that just meant there had been a lot of trauma that kid had seen and experienced because of where they lived. So you'll learn those questions over time, but kind of keep a mental note. And if you have to keep paper notes on the side somehow, it's important. One thing I learned not too long ago, we had a group come in and train our church on sexual abuse of children and teens. And I did not realize this. And I don't know what your situation is in the state of Wisconsin. You may want to check. But in the state of Georgia, there is actually a special facility that they take kids to that they think have been sexually abused or abused by an adult in some way, that is equipped with people that are trained and the things that they need to get the story out in a way that they can use it in the court situation. And they said that be very careful because sometimes if you push a child, they might tell you, but then that'll be the only time they'll tell the story. So you don't want to push a young person, especially to, oh, well, tell me more. Tell me what happened. Tell me this, tell me that. In a situation with a minor, you immediately want to call whatever your DFACS is called in Wisconsin, your child services protection people. They go by different names in different states, but here they're DFACS. But you want to immediately call them and make a report. In many states now, and legally, I would just do it, and emotionally, I would just do this for my own sanity. Volunteers are often considered mandatory reporters now. And so once again, this is another one of the things, you just err on the side of caution. If a child comes to you and indicates they've been sexually or physically abused, whether it's by a parent or someone else, some other adult, DFACS need to come in because they have the skill set to really find out if it's true or not, and who's at fault, and get the information from the child, especially younger children, in such a way that they're not even farther traumatized by the legal process. So I would highly recommend you check to see if Wisconsin has that kind of thing or what they advise there. But I know in Georgia we do, and that's what they tell us, is to not even ask a whole lot of questions, just immediately call DFACS and let them handle it.
Yeah. That's probably the same protocol in Wisconsin as well.
So that's important. Now, the types of things that you want to pay attention to will help you assess whether the trauma is, like how deep the trauma goes and how far back it goes and how much trauma there is. So, example, if someone sees a dead body being pulled out of a lake, which happened to me as a teenager, that's traumatic, but it's not nearly as traumatic if I had seen someone murdered and thrown into the lake. So there's different levels of trauma, even within kind of seeing a dead body sort of situation. Also, personality comes into it, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about resilience. But even children in the same family that experience the same thing will not necessarily be having the same symptoms. Some people are just naturally more resilient, and we'll talk about that in a different session, and they'll seem to bounce back. And then other kids, it destroys them basically. And so you can't assume anything. If two children from the same family are coming to you about the same issue, don't assume that one of them is going to react the same way as the other or has the same feelings about it or same coping skills or anything. I mean, you guys know, if you have a sibling, we joke in my family, my younger brother and I, it's like we were raised in two entirely different families. We're so different. We don't look alike. We don't think alike. Like people, even our kids all go, are you sure y'all are siblings? So, and we didn't have anything particularly traumatic happen in our family. So, you can just imagine when you add trauma to the mix that you really will have some divergence there. One of the reasons you want to really pay attention to their story is because later on, if they start talking about that they have some triggers, maybe they're triggering some sorts of a reaction in them or behaviors in them. If you already know kind of that they've told you what they saw during the experience, or they heard, or they smelled, those things are going to be the things that are going to be the triggers later on, most likely. So pay really close attention to any kind of sensory information they give you when they're talking about the situation that's causing the trauma. Because that can be really helpful, especially with children. They're not always aware enough to realize what a trigger is and a certain specific thing is triggering. And so there's a lot of detective work sometimes with children. And so if you already know, like if I already know a child has come from a situation in a city where there's a lot of bombing, then I immediately think, okay, so certain loud sounds are going to be possibly a trigger. Like I'll be able to narrow it down a little bit better than just kind of randomly guessing. And that'll save you some time and headaches when that happens. Also, when you're dealing with anybody, but particularly children and teenagers, we've seen this a lot with the refugees, is children overhear conversations that their parents have no clue that they've heard. And so they'll come out with these, what sound like really serious adult reactions to something that happened in the war, or in the way they say things. And their parents are like, where in the world are they even here? Like, how is this coming out of their sweet little heads? And most likely when I start talking to parents, they've had the news on really loud in the background, or these kids have overheard adult conversations, and the adults are not filtering what they're saying because they think the kids aren't paying attention, or the kids aren't in the room, or the kids are playing. Kids are absorbing a lot more than adults ever realize. And so I always caution parents, particularly in an ongoing situation like a war, like, don't watch that stuff in front of your kids. Try not to talk about it in ways that are not age appropriate around your children, and just assume your children will hear anything you say or anything anyone around you is saying. And not only are they hearing things that they do understand, but also a lot of times they're hearing things they don't understand, and they're putting their own spin on it. And they're getting like super, super stressed out about something that's never going to actually happen. And it's because they've just misunderstood something some grown-up said. And they're afraid to go ask the grown-up because they know the grown-up's already upset. And then they've spun this whole like tale in their heads of all these things that are going to happen that aren't going to happen, that's adding to their stress. So just watch for that, especially with smaller children. Anybody, children or adults, if the trauma that has happened has caused abrupt changes in their routines, in their family dynamic, anything like that is going to add stress to a situation that's already stressful, and possibly add to their symptoms. Same thing if they're living with people, especially, but they don't even have to live with them really. And someone in their family has reacted in a very violent way to, I don't know the better term to use, where they're very, very angry, or they've become very, even abusive. I know in war situations, and we're unfortunately seeing this in Ukraine quite a bit now, men that have been to war and come back are more likely to be abusers. And women that are exposed to war trauma also tend to have what they call explosive disorder, where they tend to overpunish their children. And so that can add to the trauma because the kid's already traumatized, and then the parent is just being especially harsh with them. And so that can just make things even worse. Just whatever's been lost. I mean, you guys have dealt with grief and you know this. So they're mourning what's been lost. But it's important to remember, anyone can be this way, but especially it tends to throw parents with children and teenagers, that they don't always mourn the things that we would mourn. And so when the war we first started going over there, we were in one country talking to a family, And we started talking about this, and the light suddenly dawned on them. Their kid was just devastated because he'd had to leave his guitar behind. He was not able to bring his guitar, and that crushed him more than any horrible thing he'd seen or heard. That was what all of his loss was focused on. And when we figured that out and we were able to get him a replacement guitar, it just turned everything around for that child. So watch out for those tertiary losses. I warn people, especially like if they had the situation made them had to move a child's school for whatever reason, then that can cause trauma because they're leaving their friends behind. They're leaving familiar favorite teachers. For an adult, if the situation caused some sort of job change, I mean, you guys all know we've all switched jobs willingly and unwillingly probably at times in our lives. And that in itself can be traumatic. And so if you have that on top of whatever the other event was, it just is a compounding factor. And so that all of these things can make physical, emotional, all those symptoms a little bit worse. Changes in caretakers, especially if it's a situation, and you guys may not run into this unless you start working with refugees or foster children, but if there's a change in the caretaker, or even if they had to change, maybe mom was a stay-at-home mom and she's had to go back to work and all of a sudden they're staying with a babysitter or going to daycare. Like all those things are much more traumatic to children than people realize, particularly evidently if one or both parents is out of the picture for a time. Maybe a father's or mother's been deployed, or something's happened where they've had to stay with, in our minds as adults, loving grandparents. It's consistent, but it's not to a child. So you just have to be kind of aware of those kinds of losses too, can play a factor. Also, in some situations, and this is more common than I think we talk about sometimes, and this happened to me actually when I was a teenager. My dad had blood clot in his lung and was in the hospital for a while. And my mother and grandmother were at each other's throats constantly. And so I kind of had to pick up the pieces at home and make sure everything was running while mom went to the hospital that wasn't close to our house and all those sorts of things. So that happens to a lot of older children and teens, as suddenly they are taking on a lot of extra adult responsibilities. And that is very stressful for them, especially because it can impact their school and their social life and a lot of other things, in addition to just having the extra responsibility. And then children and teens and adults even that have social issues already, it can exacerbate them, or it can create social issues for them that maybe they didn't have before because their behaviors changed or their situations change. They're in a new environment. And if you've ever moved as an adult, especially to a different area of the country where the culture is different, it's not an easy thing to start all over again as an adult in a new city and make new friends and everything. And so just have to bear that in mind too. Any questions about any of that?
No, I just find it all real interesting. Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about, and I'm sure both of you are familiar with what they call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah.
So just a reminder, especially when you're dealing with adults, because we're not therapists and we're not trained to be therapists and we shouldn't try to do what they do, we might not always realize they already had a lot of trauma to begin with. And so like I found this was really interesting when I was doing foster parent training here. I'd have several foster parents, we'd be talking about things, and then all of a sudden they'd go, oh, that's why I'm overreacting to the situation, because that happened to me when I was little too. And so if they've not addressed some trauma from their childhood, they're not gonna understand. Maybe they'll come to you and say, like, I feel like I'm overreacting to this thing that happened. And most likely, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's because some aspect of what has just happened has brought back some childhood trauma and they're not even really connecting the dots. And so I can't tell you, sometimes they'll figure it out on their own by things that'll happen. Sometimes you ask them questions, or sometimes just in their stories, like they'll start telling you. So things to kind of, and you guys know this, but the things to kind of listen out for, or if they have abuse, violence or neglect in their own background, if they witnessed violence, not only just in their home, but if they lived in a community, like a lot of urban children and adults have lived in a very violent community where gunshots happen all the time in the apartment complex or whatever. If they've had food or housing insecurity, if there's been a divorce or separation or death of a parent in a family, if they're absent, one or more parents are absent, if there's mental illness or substance abuse in the home, if a parent's been incarcerated. I mean, the list, depending on who you talk to, this varies. One thing is, I wrote another book a while back, Ministering to Marginalized Children, and it was very interesting. Divorce, separation, and death of a parent have a lot greater impact on children than we will admit. And it impacts boys and girls differently. And so it's just important to realize that even something that we think is commonplace nowadays can have a really great impact on somebody later, even as an adult. And so don't dismiss it when they drop these little things in conversation with you. And you guys also know ACEs are important because if they're unaddressed, these adverse experiences, not only are they causing these physical symptoms we're going to talk about in a second, or emotional symptoms now, but if they're not dealt with when they're adults, they can have very serious health problems, both mental and physical. And so the more they have, the worse it can be. I'm getting ready to do a thing with the National Urban Ministry Conference next week. And so I looked at the stats. So 60% of just people at large in the United States have had at least one adverse childhood experience. So something bad that rises to the level of being somewhat traumatic for you has probably happened to most of us between the age of birth and 18. I know I've had at least one, and I had a couple probably when I think about it. When you talk about it, urban young people, that number jumps to 83%, and 37% of them have had 4 or more ACEs, which is considered really high. Like these are the kids that are going to have some serious problems now and as adults. So I tell parents when we're talking about kids that have been through the war, and maybe you probably know more about this since you're professional counselor, but you can't say that like every time you heard a bomb go off, that's another point. You know what I'm saying? That's another ACE.
Yeah.
But it kind of does have a cumulative effect. And so it kind of helps to know like, oh, wow, this kid has been through 50 things already. This kid's probably going to struggle more than a kid that kind of sort of saw one thing or heard one thing. Or
right,
got
right. There also may be kind of a defensiveness that they created in order to be in that, to live in that environment. They might have had these protective, defenses that they kind of created that allowed them to be there. And then so sometimes it's even harder. I mean, that's more of the issue than it is the trauma. Just helping them work through these defensive
that they created,
that they've incorporated to function in the world.
Right. And one thing to remember too, and this is really important if you're dealing with children and teenagers, that one, even if they are in the womb, they pick up on the stress and the trauma. And I was saying this because when I work with adoptive parents, it's like they all seem to like, not all of them, but a lot of them go off the rails when they reach adolescence. And the parents are like, what? We got them at birth. I'm like, but there still was a trauma there, being separated from the person that you were growing in, so to speak. Even if you had the perfect time, which of course none of us do. But I was telling this story to a group of refugees, and this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, you are so true. She said, I was pregnant and we had a really bad war situation. I think she was in Kyiv, and it was bombs and they were in the shelter and it was all this noise, and it was not good. But the child was still in utero. And she said, they said, got to get out. So she went to another country and gave birth to the child in the other country. She said when her spouse, who could not leave the country, calls them, course, the daughter's, an infant still under the age of 1, and is talking to the child. And she hears the siren, every siren's going on the background now of the phone call. She loses it.
Mm.
And she said, I am firmly convinced it's because all of that, she heard all of that in the womb, and she knew it was not good. And so those noises, and we had a parent come here that we went to their city in Ukraine last year, and then they came here, and they have 3 little ones. And he said the littlest one, who was probably 3, I would say, just screams every night when those air raid alarms go off. And they live in the western part, but even there, they're going off several times a night, sometimes nights and nights in a row. So it just builds. And the other thing with kids that you have to remember too is they have to reprocess it again at every developmental stage. So when it happens when they're small and they're concrete thinkers, it kind of is what it is. They don't really think about, well, why did this happen and why did that happen? And all those bigger questions don't really necessarily bother them when they're small. And then suddenly they reach maybe adolescence and they've got all these extra, abstract processing skills. And I tell parents, I said, they're not going to always know that it's like the adopted children. They don't always know what's happening. Like, why are these things happening to me? But it's that stress from that war or whatever, all those years ago, coming back again because they need to reprocess it with the skills. And so I tell people, it's not a one and done when you're dealing with children, and even some younger teens. You're going to have to keep doing these things or do them again periodically so that they don't all of a sudden spiral, because if it happens 5 years later, you're not going to necessarily connect the dots either if you're not aware that that can happen. And so then you're going like, where is this coming from? And making all the wrong guesses because you thought the war stuff is over and done with. So I always caution people, if they're working with children or parents that have children that have been through trauma, and especially if they're younger, to just constantly reinforce, you need to keep doing these activities that we're going to talk about because they're natural activities, and you keep doing them and bring them up every couple of years and bring up these conversations, because if not, you can have a situation where all of a sudden they start spiraling again and nobody can figure out what's going on. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so what we did is, let me see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're good. What we kind of did was we broke up the symptoms into several major categories. And the reason we did that, because when we get into the intervention starting next time, we kind of group them together too. And so it just makes it easier organizationally. As far as who's going to get what symptom, you just have no clue. I mean, we literally have seen and heard, I think, just about every possible combination of symptoms known to man. But I did want to make you aware of these because some of them are war specific, but a lot of them are just trauma responses. And a few of them I was kind of actually would never have thought of on my own. And so I always like to share them because it's that kind of thing that even the doctors are probably going to be puzzled about if it happens. And so it's good just to know that this can happen. So when we talk about the physical body, it's important to pay attention. Of course, depending on the thing, there may already be some kind of physical injury that came with it, depending on what happened or what the trauma is. But also remember that a lot of times people stop eating as they normally would when they're stressed or they've had trauma. They may undereat or they may overeat. And it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of an eating disorder, but it may mean that they're malnourished in some way, especially if they're undereating. But that can happen with overeating too. So just be aware that some of the symptoms, like anemia, vitamin D deficiency because they're not going outside, that's pretty common anywhere in our country nowadays. And so just kind of watch out if you've seen those kind of physical symptoms. Don't forget that could be what's causing it. Of course, this is my family, not to overshare, but some people immediately have bowel issues, and it can go either way. Their stress immediately comes out that way. It can go either way. Sleep deprivation is very common, And we've got some great interventions that have worked well for just about everybody we've taught them to when we get to that point. Stomach aches, headaches, chest pains, abdominal pain. They may actually be physical and need to go to a doctor. You know, if you're under enough stress and you're an adult that has a bad heart, you can actually have a heart problem, or it could just be that you're having a panic attack. So don't just ignore physical symptoms, especially for an adult if it's chest pain or whatever. But just know that they can be not caused by anything other than the stress itself. Could be causing stomach aches and headaches and things. The stress can weaken their immune system, and so that they're more likely to catch colds and flus and things that are going around, which seems really cruel. Somebody's already going through trauma now is getting sick on top of that because of the stress, but unfortunately that's what happens. They could be losing weight, or they could be becoming overweight because they're just eating junk food as comfort. Children, if that gets bad enough, it can stunt their growth temporarily. It shouldn't rise to the level of being permanent over here, but it can happen. And then, of course, like we said, if it's not addressed, they can have long-term health issues like fertility problems, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, and things like that. This one I think is really interesting, and they specifically mentioned epilepsy control, but I'm sure this could be with anything that is a chronic condition that must be controlled with medication. They found in children that had been in war zones, even though their epilepsy medication was given at the same level it always had been, it was not as effective. And so if a parent comes to you and says, you know, my kid is on medication for whatever, and it just doesn't seem to be working anymore, have them go back to the doctors and have the levels checked. Because the stress can throw off how their body is processing medications. So just kind of be aware of that. Yeah.
Have you ever, because I was curious about this from one of our members of the congregation that was in Ukraine. She developed cancer after her son had been on the front lines. And this was back in 2014. So she died in, I think, 2018 of cancer. And I was wondering if you have experienced that cancer can develop from stress.
I mean, all the literature says absolutely 100%. Can I prove it? No, I'm not a doctor, but I mean, that's what the literature says. I also know that healthcare in Ukraine is not very good. And I can tell you all kinds of stories about that. And so it could have just been a situation where that cancer had been there for a while and just had not been caught early enough over there.
Okay.
Because that happens. And even the medicine over there, like, the joke amongst the Americans that go over there is like, we'll give somebody an Advil and they'll go, what is this magic medicine? You know, we'll go like, it's just Advil. And like, well, we have that, but it doesn't work. And so a lot of their medications, I don't think are necessarily well made per se. And they can't get some medications. We had a friend, one of my interpreter's daughters got some kind of lung fungal infection. And she literally had to go to Germany and live for several months because they could not get the medication in Ukraine at all. So it could be a combination of that kind of stuff. But yeah, all the literature says that you can. That's one of the things. So sadly, that could be true. And then also too, just remember if they're under a lot of stress, especially this to me is more of an older adult thing. They're not necessarily taking all their meds like they're supposed to be taking them. Especially if they're already having, and this is going to sound so weird, but we're at the age now where everybody's parents, except mine, thank God, are getting dementia. And so we have all these conversations all the time. But especially if they're just starting to have dementia, and so they're still taking their own medicines, you know what I mean, keeping up with what they take, that we found that people that are kind of starting, stress can make it worse. And so then they become more muddled, and we don't even necessarily pick up on it because we're not around them all the time. And so they may be missing meds, and then that can cause other issues. So just kind of watch out for that with older people, especially. Okay, so that's physical. Probably the biggest thing that I hear from people are the eating issues and the sleeping issues. The sleeping is huge. And we've got some great interventions that really I've honestly kind of been a little bit surprised how well they've worked for people. Okay, let's switch over to psychological and emotional impact. And a lot of these are kind of common sense. You would expect them, but I still want to go through them. Anxiety, of course, panic attacks. Panic attacks are really interesting, especially for children and teens can have them and they don't know what's going on. They can't put a name to it. Usually adults have seen enough TV or known enough people that have them that they kind of sort of know what a panic attack is, but not necessarily adults either. It was really interesting when I was in Greece. I was working with a refugee from Iran, actually, and it was a young man in his early 20s probably, and he was describing what was happening to him, and he was having to live in what I would call an internment camp over there, and he kept thinking he was having a heart attack. And they would take him to the ER, and the ER doctor was like, there's nothing wrong with you, and send him back. And he literally thought he was losing his mind because he had no idea what was going on. And then when we explained it to him, explained him how to kind of handle that, as it's, it just makes a huge difference. So, and we'll talk about how to teach him some techniques to kind of cut those panic attacks off before they get too bad. But that's really common. Especially be aware, teenage girls and young women in their 20s, there's some hormonal connection, and I haven't studied deeply enough to really know all the ins and outs of it, but they tend to be more prone to panic attacks until I think they shift a little bit in their late 20s. So just kind of be aware of that for whatever reason, but that's an issue. Fear, obviously. Hypervigilance. This is more for trauma that's of a violent nature, I would say. But it can happen. It can take the form of like hypochondria type of thing. But hypervigilance is your brain basically has had to be on alert for so long for a certain thing that it just can't turn it off. And so your brain is seeing danger everywhere. And we'll talk about how to help them manage that. But that's very, very common in war situations and urban violence, things like that. Easily startled. Okay, intrusive thoughts. This is really interesting, I thought. So when you watch movies or TV shows with a war vet and they're having the flashbacks where it's like they're actually going back and reliving a situation that was traumatic, children and teens don't generally have flashbacks like that. What they will have is what they call intrusive thoughts. So it's like they are intentionally kind of choosing to think about that thing and they can't stop thinking about it. That it's not exactly the same as a flashback in the way that an adult experiences it, which is actually kind of good because it's easier to teach them how to deal with their intrusive thoughts and get off of that than I think it would be to deal with a flashback, which is not my area of expertise because I focus on the children and teenagers more. So we're not going to do a lot about flashbacks and adult PTSD, but there's a lot of literature on that if you get into that. But just know that when a child's talking about, I can't stop thinking about the bomb or whatever, they literally are having intrusive thoughts. It is not a flashback in the way an adult would experience it, more than likely. We've already talked about sleep disturbances, including delayed or interrupted sleep. So they may say, I have trouble getting to sleep, or I go to sleep and then I wake up and can't get back to sleep, or they may be having nightmares, and there's some things we can do to help them with all that. They may regress and have bedwetting. So that will calm usually as the trauma calms. We've already talked about nightmares and night terrors. There's a difference. I did not realize this until I was doing all this work. So the nightmare we were familiar with, the night terror, and our daughter had a couple of these when she was little. They're scarier to the parent, but the kid does not remember them when they wake up. Those are the ones where they will often get up and sleepwalk, or they'll start like screaming and flailing. But for whatever reason, the way their brains work, they don't remember those the next morning, where a nightmare they will. And they said that night terrors are more scary to the adults because the kid is like sleepwalking or freaking out, but they really are less traumatic to the child because they don't have any memory of them the next day. Eating disorders, really watch for this. Obviously, this can be teenage boys or girls. A lot of times with boys, it will manifest itself more in exercise. They'll over exercise like constantly rather than an eating disorder per se, but they can have eating disorders too. Um, we tend to think of anorexia, but don't forget bulimia. And my big sister in sorority in college had bulimia, and we had no clue because she wasn't losing weight. She was just her normal weight, and she wasn't necessarily eating more than any of the rest of us were in front of us. So bulimia is a little bit harder to catch, but there are signs. Um, PTSD, of course, depression, a pessimistic outlook, and lack of hope. Um, that one's really interesting because we found if we empowered people to do things to ease their symptoms, most of them became more optimistic just naturally. There was one country we went to where they seemed super pessimistic compared to every other country we had been to. And we couldn't figure it out at first. Like, why is it so different here? Because the country was a great country. Like, I would have lived in a country that's beautiful. But we finally figured out what it was is that the Christians in that particular country were letting the people just go on and on and on about the same thing over and over and over again and weren't trying to help them move forward. And so they were kind of becoming enmeshed in their despair, for lack of a better way of putting it, instead of going, wow, that was really horrible. Now let's think of some things we can do to help you feel better or heal or whatever. They hadn't been doing that. And so they were getting into clinical depression, some of them there. Mm-hmm.
No, I just find that interesting that that to get into that trap of like participating in the ruminating, you know.
And the only way we even figured it out was because one of the Americans that lived there made some offhanded comment about, yeah, they just call us in the middle of the night and just keep saying the same thing over and over again. And I thought, oh, that's it. Nowhere else have we been that they are allowed to do that. Like they're allowed when they first come here, obviously. And it's not that you never let them talk about it, but it was more in other places. There was more of an effort or like, wow, that was really horrible. Now, how can we get you settled? How can we help you find a job or a place to live or your kids at school? Like it was like, how can we help you move on was more of the mindset. And they were just allowing them to kind of wallow in it there. And they were becoming clinically depressed.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting. That's the first time I'd ever seen that. And thankfully we haven't seen that anywhere else, but it was just real interesting. So we had to kind of go like, you need to stop that. It's not helping them. Watch for increase in risk-taking behaviors. And this is a personality thing. They see a lot in teenagers, but I think you can see this, obviously you see this in adults too. And you can even see it in little kids. Like who was it? We were somewhere and they're telling me that their child was like suddenly like jumping off of high places and just doing like what would have been normal behaviors for some kids, but was not normal for their child. It was more risk-taking behavior for their child's personality. And so watch for things like that because it, and it's not always dangerous, but it can lead to very dangerous risk-taking behaviors. And they're particularly obviously concerned about drugs and alcohol and sexual acting out. Let's see, lower self-esteem. Some people just think everybody looks at them differently when something bad's happened. And so they look at themselves differently, and that's not usually in a positive way. Anger, rage, and bitterness. And we'll talk about this later. This whole forgiveness piece is huge. If it's something that has to be forgiven, like some things, it just is. But if they are, for whatever reason, angry at someone or for what has happened, that really has to be dealt with and quickly. Because that was one of the reasons we started this as soon as we did before the war was even over. And we're hearing stories now of people that we did not work with, that anger is becoming bitterness and rage, and it's going to be much harder to root out. And it's a hard conversation, and we'll talk about that later. It's not, believe me, it's not easy. I avoided it at first, and then I realized I couldn't avoid it anymore, and it's never fun, but you have to help them deal with that, or it's not good. Guilt.
Can I ask when you address that anger, like because I've talked to several people about like the need to forgive and but whenever you like bring it up, it tends to kind of push them further into their
Yeah,
anger
yeah.
rather than
So what I do, and it's easier in this particular situation, but I think you could do it with just about anything. I usually start with kind of like, I know you're not ready to talk about this yet, and I understand that. I probably wouldn't be ready to talk about this yet either if I were in your situation, right? And then I kind of go into, and with them, it's obviously Putin and the Russians, like it's very cut and dry. Some people, it's not going to be so cut and dry. Like they may not be able to, they may not even know who they're really angry at. They're just maybe angry at the situation. But it's, to me, it's easier to talk them through if it is a person like Putin, because here's something that when I thought started really thinking through it, we had these conversations about it, because even some of the really, really strong Christians were like, I'll never forgive Putin for did it. And we're like, whoa, this is bad. Because you know better and you're talking like this. And then we got talking about it, and like, of course it's natural because he's just some of these people, this is the third time the Russians have destroyed everything they've worked for their entire life and they've had to move in their lifetime. Like 3 times now within a span of 20, 30 years, they've had to totally redo this. And so it kind of has built for some of these people. But what you try to help them understand is, and we'll talk about this a lot later, but being angry at Putin doesn't hurt Putin.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, Putin doesn't even care if you're angry with him. It does not impact Putin one way or another. He couldn't care less if you're mad at him. And quite frankly, even if you told him you were mad at him, he wouldn't care. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so a lot of these people at least been exposed enough to Christianity that like going and killing Putin themselves personally is not an option. You know what I mean? So it's not like like I'm going to go kill him kind of situation. It's just like, I will never be able to forgive this. And then, especially if they have children, they're easier to reason with, because we start talking about and we've got to say, this is what anger does to your body. Anger destroys your body, your mental health, your soul, but it's also going to destroy your children. So this person, who in this case is Putin, has destroyed this part of your life. 100%. I'm not going to argue that whatsoever. But if you hold on to your anger and your bitterness for the rest of your life, you have allowed this person to ruin the rest of your life. Do you really want to give that person that power? And I won't say that every person immediately goes, oh, you're right, I'm going to, start working to let this go. In fact, it's really funny. I was in Greece, and this one dad and his family had just come from a really bad area. And so when I even brought up, oh, this is not going to go well because they just came out and they're just going to lose it. And sure enough, the dad just like, he was just in the back and he was just chewing the ear out of somebody that had brought me in. And that thankfully the person was a strong Christian. I was like, she's right. You've got to deal, And I thought, oh, this man is never going to forgive me now for bringing this up. But I spoke in the same city later that week. He showed up again. And he was like very apologetic. Like, I've read your book and like, I'm not there yet, but I get it. You know what I mean? And I'll even tell them that. I'm like, this may be the hardest thing you ever do in your life is figure out how to let this go. But as a Christian, I've got to trust God enough to know that God is going to handle that person. God will handle Putin. You know what I mean? One way or another, Putin's going to be dealt with. And I don't have to be a part of that. I don't even have to worry about it. I just have to trust that God is going to do that and let it go and not let Putin ruin the rest of my life like he's already ruined part of it. And that intellectually seems to make more sense to them. Because I don't think you think of it that way. You think of it kind of emotionally, like if I could just tell this person, then they would be sorry and they would apologize. They're never going to apologize, most likely. You know what I mean? Because horrible people do horrible things and they don't care. That's why they do them, So even if you could confront the person, they're not going to go, oh, you're right, I was horrible. Now, things that don't rise to level trauma, people do apologize if you give them a chance. But usually something like a murder or something like that, that type of person is not necessarily going to apologize, or a Putin situation. So once they kind of can wrap their brain around that, and that they're only hurting themselves, they're now hurting themselves, not Putin, not the person that, did whatever to them. They may not be able to let go, but it helps. And I'll tell you, I kind of read through that Lisa Turk, what's that? I should say her name, Turkhurst thing about forgiving what you can't forget or whatever. And she had some good points, I think, in that she said part of the problem is that people think it's a one and done thing. Like, oh, I forgave that person because they did XYZ to me. But that XYZ, it wasn't just one thing. It had kind of a domino effect, and you kind of have to forgive all the little domino effects. And what happens is when one of the dominoes falls, then all the anger comes back up again. Or like, we took an elder over with us that was a military vet from us that had PTSD from the Gulf War. And he said, you have to warn people that think they've forgiven whatever, that like on anniversaries of stuff like 9/11, when they show all the things, that those feelings can come back up, and that you have to do the work again. And I think letting people know that is empowering, because then they don't think, well, I thought I dealt with that. Something's wrong with me. I'm not spiritual because I'd forgiven that person, and now this thing reminded me of it, and I'm all angry again. No, you're human. So just do the work again, and it'll be easier this time because you've already figured out how to do it. So just letting people know seems to relax them. So, but I think in just empathizing with them that, yeah, that stunk. And that person doing that stunk. And this is going to be the hardest thing you're going to ever have to do, but then explaining to them why. And not just because God said so, which hopefully with a Christian would hold some weight. But when you're emotional, that doesn't necessarily work. And so it has to be like, you're going to give this person power to destroy a lot more than they already have if you don't let it go. And it doesn't hurt them one little bit because they don't care. So I don't know if that helps. But then also we give them, and we'll talk about that when we get to anger, we do give them a lot of anger control, anger management strategies to help calm themselves in the moment. Especially if they tend to act out in some way when they're angry. Because that's important to teach them some impulse control and some anger management, things like that. Also in the psychological thing, I want to go to, we're good. Okay. You may see shame and guilt, and that often is survivor guilt. So in other words, if they were in a situation and maybe a friend was hurt or killed and they weren't, that's a real interesting thing that you wouldn't think. You think they would just be thankful, but it really can cause some people some really serious problems. Like if they were in a car wreck and maybe other people in the car were killed, even if they weren't driving, there can be survivor guilt. And they can actually self-sabotage their future because in some way they feel like they have to compensate that they weren't killed. And it's different ways in different people. It's really interesting to go into that, but you may see that some. I didn't see that a lot, but it can happen. Emotionally numbing and repression, which you were talking about earlier, where they've learned just to tamp down those feelings and kind of, which as we all know, will come back and explode at some point. But for the moment anyway, they've been able to tamp them down to some extent. So you may not see much. The far extreme of that we saw, and I've never seen anybody like this, and they called it shell shock. I've never even heard the term because it's an older term in the US that we don't use anymore, I don't think. But basically it was a catatonic, a child that was so scarred from the war trauma that she was basically catatonic. Wow. And she was the one, I was so shocked. We saw her a year later and they had just been doing this stuff. I don't think she'd gone to a therapist because there really aren't anywhere they were that much. And she was like a different child. She was like, it was amazing. But yeah, they can really withdraw, especially if that's their personality anyway, to an extent. And then they can have difficulty experiencing positive emotions. This could be twofold. It could be that they just have a hard time feeling positive emotions anymore. Or it can also be that they're uncomfortable feeling a positive emotion because they feel like maybe they shouldn't. because all these bad things are happening. And so, like, should I be smiling and laughing when everybody around me is sad? Like, I don't know. That doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel right. It's kind of like laughing at a funeral. You know, it's kind of like, ooh, I don't know if I should have done that. Um, the thing about experiencing actually being able to feel positive emotions, and I tell people this a lot, the brain is meant to be flexible, especially with children and teenagers. And we'll talk about this more when we get into the morning later, but your brain is meant to cycle in and out of different emotions throughout the course of a day. And if we stay in one emotional state too long, our brains can kind of become stuck. And there are some people, and I don't necessarily disagree with us, there are some people that think there is an aspect to depression, that's what has happened. They have just stayed so sad so long that their brain has trouble now flipping the switch and becoming happy again or feeling other emotions. And so I often tell people in situations like this or trauma situations with children especially, is to take what I call joy breaks. Do something fun, do something that makes them laugh. Even if the adult doesn't particularly feel like laughing, the kids really need to take an emotional break a couple times a day if possible, and do something fun or joyful, so their brains don't get stuck. Okay, any questions about any of that?
No.
And I think we talked about suicide earlier. I don't know if I mentioned it again with this, but that, of course, goes in with all this. All right, let's talk about behavior, because this can impact adults. But honestly, this is what I often get a lot of questions with from parents, because it comes out in the behaviors of the children. So if a child's been through trauma, different personalities, once again, come out different ways, but some of them, not all of them, you will suddenly see them become aggressive, even violent. I think it's more common in these situations where what happened was violent, like a war situation, community violence, things like that, because that anger is just building up and they don't know what to do with it. Antisocial behaviors, they might not want to have anything to do with anybody. We saw this quite a bit. Increased alcohol consumption, binge drinking, illegal drug use, substance abuse. Now, I don't know if you guys were aware of this, but now you can go to the grocery store and buy these non-alcoholic drinks that are basically have hallucinogens and cannabis and stuff in them. And I don't know if they're age controlled or not. I've not checked into it, but they're selling them like in the grocery stores and online and stuff. So it's easier for them to get. And of course, you know, marijuana use is legal in some places now, and it's much, much stronger than it was back in the day. And it's causing a lot of ER visits for psychosis. So just watch for that kind of stuff. And of course, you all know how bad fentanyl can be. Early sexual debut. This is quite common when they're stressed, because they want to feel love, they want to feel connection, and so sometimes they'll act it out that way. They may run away if the situation at home was not particularly great to begin with. Maybe there was stress already that can just push them over the edge where they run away. They may do attention-seeking behaviors, and that can be the little kid tugging on mom and acting out, to a teenager doing the more obvious things. So, and really spouses can do this. You know, adults live in the same house. If they feel like the spouse is suddenly not giving them attention because they're so upset about whatever happened and they're feeling left out, you know, they can start acting out too. Tantrums, crying, angry outbursts, social withdrawal, feelings of loss of control or an excessive need to control. And we saw that quite a bit. Not necessarily to the level of OCD, but definitely some control issues with some of the kids and adults too, really. Lack of trust, overly suspicious, which ironically enough with the refugees, some of them seem to go the opposite way. I felt like they were overly naive, and maybe I don't know if it was I didn't see that in any literature, but I just saw that in real life. So I don't know what that's about. maybe they just want to be comforted, and so they would believe anything anybody said just to feel better. I really don't know, because I've never saw anything in the literature, but I saw that several, especially single women, I saw that they were getting involved in situations that I felt like they were too savvy. You know what I mean? Like dating, online dating. Like, I'm like, you seem like you're an attorney where you were like, I don't understand. But I just think they just needed to feel normal and feel loved. And so they were more susceptible to some of that kind of stuff. Reactions to triggers, and we'll talk about a lot about that coming up in another session. And problems making or keeping friends. And when we get into triggers, this one is very interesting as far as the behaviors, particularly of children and teens, because the fear response, the flight, fight, or freeze reaction will look like, to an adult, rebellion. And so the adult tries to handle it like the child's being rebellious, but the child has to be calmed before the behavior can be dealt with and corrected, and better alternatives chosen, because nothing gets through to them while they're in that state mentally. And we'll talk about that in more depth, but just be aware that sometimes these kids are being yelled at and it's really just a fear reaction response and not outright rebellion. And so it needs to be handled just a little bit differently when those kind of behaviors happen. Academically, some of these also will impact adults, but obviously not in a school way, and they may mention this as part of their life issues. They will have difficulties, particularly concentration and memory. Are impacted by stress. And so with children, they also their grades can go down, their educational progress can slow, they may miss school more. This is very minutia, but just so you know, if a boy is separated temporarily from both parents, their IQ scores are lower. If the boys are separated from their parents before school age, it lowers their verbal ability. And decline in math, reasoning, general knowledge, and certain vocabulary test scores if they're exposed to violence in early childhood. So I know that's very minutia, but just be aware if they're suddenly struggling in certain areas in school, it may be about the stress and not necessarily a learning issue per se. So that, and then, and there are a lot of fun things that you can do with the adults and the kids to help them with their memory and their concentration issues. And then the last big area is just spiritual. And these are going to vary a little bit. These particular things are particularly for children that experienced war and community violence, but I think they are sort of across the board too with any trauma. And the main problems that they saw were loss of hope, a loss of feeling of meaning and purpose for their lives, and a change in ideas of what's right and wrong. And this just still blows my mind. So when I was doing all of this research, there was more than one secular study now that found that the only children that really healed well from war trauma were children who were religious. And they think it's because for secular people, hope and things like that are based more on circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so I can't promise a child in Ukraine that war is going to end. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know, But as a Christian, I have a different view, and it's a bigger view, it's a longer term view, and there's hope in that regardless of my circumstances. And the same thing with the meaning and purpose. Yes, secular people can have meaning and purpose in their life, but in Christianity, it's just there's much deeper levels to everything, and they need that deepness. One of the things that we experimented with that worked really, really well, and made sense when we thought about it, because we'd actually done this with an orphanage in Mexico. The kids there, is these kids get so used to everybody serving them because of the trauma that they've been through and the bad things that have happened, that actually getting them to serve someone else it's life changing. It's amazing to watch how these kids change just like virtually in front of your eyes because you've shown them they have something they can do to help somebody else. It's just it's really interesting. So I highly recommend that. And then of course, the changing ideas of right and wrong. A lot of our young people struggle with that anyway because it's just whoever has the social media power at the time decides what's right and what's wrong, and that doesn't necessarily stay the same from day to day or week to week. And so having that constant moral compass in the Bible, then it just makes life a lot easier for kids who are already feeling like they're living in chaos all the time. So anything else that you want to know about the symptoms? And I know we just have a few more minutes, but I'm just going to start because this I think is important, and then we'll actually go into specific interventions next time. The main thing you want to do if you're whoever you're working with is encourage them to make their home environment as calming and soothing and comforting as possible. The Danish, I think it's Hygge. The Danish are like experts at this whole thing, and that word doesn't even translate to English exactly, but it's kind of like comforting. And so you want to come into a soothing environment because for someone who's going through trauma or has been through trauma, to them, the world is chaos and it's dangerous and it's scary for a variety of reasons. So they need a safe space. And even in refugee centers, they often will have just their own little room that they're all crammed into. But anything that they can do to make that space comforting. So some of the things that we suggest, of course, just the opposite basics of like turning off the TV and not constantly being on social media, not constantly listening to the news, like really limiting themselves to how much exposure they get. Even if it has nothing to do with their personal trauma, it's still very negative. Everything is negative, and social media is so negative, and so they just don't need that constant extra stress of that. Music. They need to have that soothing music, whatever that is to them or their children, and they're cuddling their children. Reading Psalms. Psalms is an amazing book of the Bible for people that are stressed out. It's just so comforting to read the Psalms. Praying with their child, finding ways to exercise safely to work off nervous energy. But even within the environment, like if they can paint it, and I know this really sounds silly, but if you can paint it and have things that are decorated that are blues and greens and purples, they're more soothing. And if you can't paint the walls, then make sure that if you can afford to switch out the bedding, do that. Soft and fuzzy goes a long way with people. I mean, literally, my daughter is 20, she'll be 29 this year. This is her fuzzy blanket. She lives in California. They work at Pepperdine. She has a fuzzy blanket she leaves at her house for when they visit. So she has a fuzzy blanket. And my best friend and I we weren't laughing at her, but we were kind of laughing because they had to evacuate in the fire. Thank the Lord, their place was not burned ultimately. But she called me. She's like, well, we're trying to figure out what we can take because their situation was just really weird that week anyway. And they just have one little car. And so she's like, we're taking our papers and we're taking, her husband's a musician. We're taking his guitar. And then my best friend had crocheted her a blanket that she took with her when she went off to college. And I've got Auntie Donna's blanket. And we were just laughing. She's like, I think Auntie Donna would have knitted you a new blanket had anything happened to it. But I was talking to another friend that had an adult child, and their child had gone through something, and it was the same thing. Like those little comfort items, the fuzzy thing, the something that somebody's made, a stuffed animal. And children and adults, too, will regress a lot of times when they're stressed and they've been through trauma. So child and parent, I get this question a million times. My kid hasn't needed a nightlight and all of a sudden they need a nightlight, or they gave up sucking their thumb and they're sucking their thumb, or they gave up the teddy bear and they want a teddy bear. And what I always tell people is let them have whatever comforts them if there's nothing wrong with it. If it's not hurting them in some way, let them have it. They will let go of it again when they have healed. And honestly, of the battles that you need to fight with your kids sometimes, whether or not they have a nightlight or a teddy bear when they go off to college or they get married, you know what? There are worse things in life than that. And their peers or their spouse may take care of that, or they may have one the rest of life. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. But make sure that they're surrounded with comforting things like that. Nature, bringing nature into the house, whether that's cut flowers or even we do things with homeless families at our church where they come and they rotate and stay at the church for a week. And we've just gotten nature photographs that are framed that we put in each of their temporary bedrooms to just have some nature in the room with them. So just some kind of nature. Nature is very soothing, whether they can be out in it or bring it in. Animals, now, some people are animal people, some people aren't. But I mean, I know at Pepperdine, they bring in dogs during finals for the kids to play with the dogs because it calms them and soothes them. So a lot of that. Sunlight, get them in the sun as much as you can, sunscreen, whatever, but they need that sunlight. Helps their immune system, helps their moods. They just need to be out in it as much as they can. Once again, if there's fear things, our daughter went through this when she was little. She had a great aunt that died that she was really close to, and that's the first death she'd ever experienced. And all of a sudden she needed a nightlight, and like she never needed one. We're like, what's going on? But they may need those things, or keeping the doors slightly open or shut, anything that you can accommodate. Some kids may need to put their mattress on the floor because they're afraid something's going to be under their bed. Once again, pick your battles. If your kid is super stressed and they've been through something horrific, it's not the end of the world if you take the bed frame down and put them on the floor for a while so that they feel safe until things calm down a little bit. Weighted blankets, and you don't have to necessarily, and they're not that expensive anymore, but you don't even have to get a full blanket. They make the little lap pads now that are weighted that seem to work, and they have vests that are weighted too. They also have these things called sensory body socks that kids with autism will sometimes use that will work with some kids, where it's just literally like a big knit thing you step into and pull away up and put over your head. And I've watched kids use them, and it really does soothe a lot of kids. You just have to kind of experiment, though, really honestly, with kids. Also, earplugs and noise canceling earphones. If they are hypervigilant, if their nerves are on edge all the time, sometimes being able to cut out some of that extra loud noises and things like that can be soothing to them. Okay, I think we probably are going to stop there because that's a good break. Any questions on anything?
Thank you.
Well, I know this is a lot of review for you guys, but I feel like for those that listen to the tape, having this background will make it easier to understand some of the interventions that we're doing and why we're doing them, or how they're working, or what they're helping solve. So
yeah, no, it was a great review, and I appreciate some of what you've shared about Ukraine and some of the things to be thoughtful and mindful of in regards to their experiences. That was really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot. Even though we've done a lot of research, you learn a lot just being out there and talking to people and hearing their stories and seeing what works and what really makes the difference. And like I said, some of this stuff, there are a couple things, especially when we get into art, that we literally, my team and I were just, our mouths almost dropped open because we'd read it. We knew it was supposed to do that. But then when you actually see it happen, you're like, wow, this is
what happens. Yeah.
It's amazing how well it does work. It was just kind of interesting. And even some of the stuff, it was interesting to me too, because you knew it was supposed to work with the children, but then to see it work with the teens, and then to have the parents come back. Because at the beginning, we never really addressed the parent issues at all. And then we learned, because the parents kept coming back to us and said, I did it with my kids and I feel so much better. That we now tell parents, do this with your children. It's going to help you too, And so it's some things we've just kind of learned as we've gone along. But anyway, well, feel free to, if you have any questions between now and the next time, or if anything comes up that you want to address or make sure that we address, feel free to email me or email Katie and she can email me. So
Yeah.
we make sure we get everything. Did you have, since you're a professional counselor, did you have anything you wanted to add to any of that?
No, this was good. It was a very good, nice review. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It was good to hear some things and the way just kind of being thoughtful and like I said, considerate about what people experience and how different everybody responds to it.
Yeah, it really is amazing. In fact, one of the most interesting, we went to one city and I was working with teenagers there, and they all different stories, all different parts of, but basically very much similar background stories as what they'd seen and experienced and stuff. And we were doing one activity. Oh, I know what it was. We did the self-portrait thing where they did half of how they see themselves, half how the world sees them, and then wrote around them like how they think God sees them and stuff, and having conversations and stuff. And these two brothers, like their resilience was off the charts. Like we were just like, okay, I like literally pulled them aside because they both spoke English. And I was like, okay, who are your parents? Because I just knew like they were so much more resilient than all the other kids that they had. And it turned out they had very, very special parents who had been very intentional and, were like minister. Like it was a really good story. But it just made it so obvious to me, like what difference a parent could make and how a child responded to the similar trauma.
Right. And building building that resilience.
Building that resilience into them. In fact, that's what my son-in-law actually does for Pepperdine. He's in their resilience department because they have so many young people now that basically are not being raised by their parents. I mean, they're physically there, but you know what I'm saying? They're not teaching them the things. And so they have zero resilience, zero. Like they become suicidal if they get a bad grade or somebody breaks up with them. That Pepperdine now and a lot of other universities are copying